Well, it's been over 25 years since I've been here, which almost makes me dizzy to think of. Oh, I did come by once after my beloved secretary, Phyllis Perry, died, and I visited her grave with her husband, Frank. I also visited her before she died. But I have not been in this building for over a quarter of a century. And what's been done to the building leaves me in complete joyful amazement. Congratulations. I now live in Columbus, Ohio, the 14th largest city in the United States of America. It's a city which almost nobody knows anything about because we don't have any football teams or baseball teams, and nobody cares otherwise. We have the second largest university in the United States, Ohio State, and we have a dozen other schools of higher education and professional education. So our city's population always looks relatively young to me. And many people who graduate stay in Columbus because they like it so much. Ohio also has the largest number of archaeological sites amongst all the 50 states, something that most people don't know because our schools don't teach things like that. Right in the middle of Columbus stands a mound built by the Adena people 200 years before the beginning of our era, so at the time of the Maccabees. This mound was built and somebody was buried there. And all over Ohio, you'll see mounds and pyramids, quite large, and whole cities that used to have walls, and nobody talks about that. But it's one of the great things about Ohio for me. As for me personally, a lot of things have changed in my life in the last 25 years. I've had health problems, as so many other people have had, and I now have a defibrillator pacemaker here in my chest. It's an inherited problem, apparently. My grandmother, Carmelina, died while I served here, but my grandmother, Anna, with one of the longest cases of Alzheimer's in recorded history, medical history, according to her doctor, died after I moved to Columbus. Both of my parents, neither of whom had any siblings, have died. My mother outlasting my very difficult father for almost 2 years, and finally becoming the strong woman she had always been, but which had been kept in check by my father's nearly constant rage. My brother, Robert, died tragically of alcoholism at age 58. In most ways, his was the saddest memorial I ever conducted amongst the hundreds that I've done in my life. My sister and I still talk now and then. You know, the organ recital. Many of us 70-year-olds are prone to. This organ hurts, this organ hurts. But the huge Confederate flag that dominates the living room with Fox News blaring keeps me pretty far away. But this does not suggest that I'm utterly alone and living without a loving and beautiful family in Columbus. Oh, when I first moved there, I knew nobody except people in the church, and just very early getting to know people in the church, and I ate my first Thanksgiving dinner alone. But I do have a family, and here's the first story. One day, I asked my friend Babar, who was a gay Pakistani Muslim, what kind of food he grew up with. Is it like Indian curry? I have no idea, I said, what Pakistani food is like, never having seen a Pakistani restaurant. He says, well, how about if I cook a dinner like my mother used to make for Eid? Answer your question with home-cooked food. And I said, that's an excellent answer. So I showed up at his place. 12 people were there. I didn't know anyone except for Babar's boyfriend. We sat on the floor. There was a tablecloth on the floor. We were instructed to eat with our right hands. The left hand was verboten in his culture. He brought out at least a dozen dishes. I was sitting next to a man with a rather full, dark beard, unusual back in those days, in a more clean-shaven era for men. I assumed he was about 30. We introduced ourselves. "I'm Tony," he said. But we didn't really talk, just tasted the many courses. Babar brought out a bowl of dip of some kind and some pita-like bread and informed us we needed to tear the bread and dip this into the bowl. And we were certain it was hummus. But after we tasted it, Tony said to me, "I don't taste any chickpeas any place in this dish. It's not hummus. Babar, what is this?" "My mother's favorite dip for Eid, curried goat brains." Which was the reaction that we had. So we both started laughing hysterically, and we kind of fell back on the floor. We just thought it was the funniest thing. But that certainly broke the ice, and soon Tony and I started talking about everything. To my surprise, I found out that he was only 19. "Yeah, everyone thinks I look like I'm 30, he said. We exchanged phone numbers, and we would get together sometimes and walk and talk or have dinner for about a year. And then one day, after breaking up with his boyfriend, who was a very heavy drinker and prone to violence, I invited him to live in my spare room for a while to recover. A few months later, he met someone, they dated, and eventually this man, Colin, asked him to go out west while attending grad school. He asked my opinion about this turn of events. Now, I knew Tony had a troubled childhood. His mother died of cancer when he was 8. His drunk, violent father was in prison. He was abused by step-parents and his grandparents, who he eventually lived with during high school. So when he asked what I thought, I said, "Look, Tony, just go see the wider world with Colin. Colin is a very serene person, and he's a kind man, and Ohio has not been very good to you. Go find a part of the world where pain and betrayal do not rule your life. And if things don't work out, you're always welcome to come back here to Columbus. I'll even pay your way if you need to." On the way out to the West Coast, Tony called me every single day. He started calling me, "Hey, Babo, hey, Babo," on the pattern I thought naively back then of me saying to him, "Hey, kiddo, hey, kiddo." But one day, I asked him if he knew the word Baba was actually an Italian word. He says, "Oh, I know, I love Italian films. Babo means dad." I was deeply moved by this and surprised, but we talked about what that meant every day for a week, and eventually we agreed and covenanted together to be father and son for the rest of our lives. I think the family we created for ourselves by that covenant is the best thing that either of us have ever done. He just turned 41 last Tuesday. We've been father and son for 22 years now. And there he is. Now, the question of who makes up a family is obviously an old one. The Gospel of Mark was written by the anonymous author about 2,000 years ago, and that very question was put on the lips of the Galilean. Who is my mother? Who are my brothers and sisters? This was a shocking and radical question to ask in the patriarchal culture of the ancient Mediterranean world, where blood and family loyalty was everything. But nevertheless, I intend to answer that question for myself this morning, as I've already started to do. Now, obviously, this gospel story shows us that the concept of chosen family is not a recent discovery, even if the phrase itself, chosen family, dates only to 1991, invented by an anthropologist, Kath Weston. And in my own blood family, my parents being only children meant that all of my aunts, or as we said in Detroit, aunts, All of my aunts and my uncles were not related to me by blood, and my second cousins were called cousins. They were my parents' friends, my aunts and my uncles, and their children, albeit all of them being speakers of the Emilian Italian dialect that my family spoke. They were all my family, even though we weren't related by blood. So we always used ordinary family language for all of these people. Now, besides becoming a father in a family on the pattern of my parents, I have added other family names as well to my life, including for myself. A week ago at my local cafe called Parable, I ran into my friend Marcus, and a few minutes later, a group of young people came in and greeted Marcus. I didn't know any of them, but Marcus introduced me to all these people. And then one of the women came over to me and said, "Oh, you're Marco?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Oh, Charles talks about you." And Charles, one of the baristas at the Parable Cafe, had become a friend recently. She introduced herself as his girlfriend, Grace. We talked about her recent trip to Maine to visit family, especially her grandmother, whom she clearly adored and went on about for a long time. I immediately responded that I adored my grandmothers too. After we shared stories for a while, she suddenly said to me, "You know, I have to say something to you. You remind me of my grandmother an awful lot, the way you talk, the stories you tell." And I said, "That, Grace, is the best compliment I've received in a very long time. Thank you." She didn't know that since I retired almost 9 years ago now, I have begun to think of myself as a grandmother, or better, a fusion of my two grandmothers, Carmelina and Anna. Like Grace, I adored my two grandmothers. Why? They were my love teachers. They welcomed everyone into their homes, their neighbors and friends from across the nation and even from Europe, especially my grandmother Anna. Carmelina lived in a neighborhood in Detroit that was primarily black, and she and my grandfather Nazareno invited their neighbors over for homemade bread and home-brewed wine all the time in conversation, which back in the 50s and 60s was rather unusual. But having grown up in the mountains of Emilia in Italy, they were not raised in the continuously racializing culture of the United States of America, and they didn't understand why such foolishness existed. My two grandmothers, that's my grandmother Carmelina with her fig tree, which in Detroit don't grow, but they made it grow. And that's my grandmother with my mother as a child on her lap. That's my grandmother Anna. She was a single mother for a long time because her husband died of meningitis. And then she married my grandfather Umberto, who I never called step-grandfather. He was my grandfather. And they also were the ones who cooked the holiday dinners. And the proverb, "Food is love," was made alive in their feasts. I did love my two grandfathers too, Nazareno and Umberto. But like the grandfather in the story that you watched this morning, they were quieter. Their love was more the sharing of silent walks or weeping with me at the end of Madama Butterfly or other operas that Umberto took me to. "This is your music," he used to tell me when I was a child. And although my grandparents all spoke accented English, all of them left the word for family in Italian, la famiglia, totally untranslated because it was a sacred word. Now, besides thinking of myself as a grandmother, I am also more than a father and a grandmother. Richard, Kevin, and Doug and I all call each other brother. So that's Kevin, that's Richard, and there's Doug. And Richard even uses the Italian to call me caro fratello, dear brother. This language of family is important to all of us. It's not just this, hey bro, slap on the back. This is the deeper language of family. Long, deep conversations, heart-to-hearts. These men are very important to me. They are my brothers. Doug and I, in fact, have talked every single day for the last 10 years. And even when he travels to Vietnam or biking across Italy, like he tends to do, we talk. In the last 8 years, I have come to love a young trans person named Honey. They live in New York, although they once lived in Columbus. I am 75, they are 30. So one day we decided to honor the family nature of our relationship as grandparent and grandchild. We refer to each other now by a word that we mutually came up with to fuse our friendship and family terminology. We are grandfriends. There's Honey. Early in my time in Columbus, I met a man named Jimmy, and he has been part of my holiday table for 20 years, often with his daughter early on. Jimmy has always called me uncle, and I introduce him whenever I introduce him as my nephew. There's Jimmy. Now, please listen to me. I'm not in any way saying that chosen family is better than blood family. My best friend from high school, Chuck Jepka, whom I have loved for 57 years, has been married to Jane Jepka, who is a UU minister, the first UU I ever met. And their marriage is absolutely wonderful. They just celebrated 54 years. And their 2 sons are my oldest godchildren, and they're emblematic of what a great family can be. And they're hardly the only ones. But in my life, even as I created family here in California, although when I was here, I didn't use that language, but I used to have people for dinner, for holidays and stuff. But I lost the great majority of them to death, mostly to AIDS. I lived here in the 80s and 90s, and in that era, it was the time of eternal grief. I did memorials here in this congregation, but I also did 30-some memorials outside this congregation for friends whom I loved dearly. When my best friend, Stefan, died in 1995 on Valentine's Day, the people in this congregation, this marvelous congregation, not only supported me in my grief as he was dying. You need to spend more time with your best friend and less time with us, said a board member to me at that time. But when he did die, the great majority of this congregation crossed the bridge to San Francisco and attended the memorial service I led with the rabbi at the congregation of Shahar Zahav. During that time, I went through a period when I hated the word hope because I had none. I lived in grief constantly, day in and day out. I cried every single day, sometimes twice. But I pretended to be okay, as many of us often tend to do. But I was not okay. A part of me actually no longer wanted to live. What's the world without Stefan? Nothing, an empty planet. That's the way I felt emotionally. My grief was all-consuming. One day, however, I chanced to find the poem by Liesel Mueller that you heard when Marilyn read it. As soon as I got to the last word of that poem, I wept. And then I wept again. I suddenly realized that hope is not some theological abstraction, but it's all around me, in the buds daring to open into flowers reliably every year. They can't help it. In the seeds falling from the trees, promising new green trees, they can't help it. It's what they do. In the intake of the breath of a newborn, hope, says Mueller, is the singular gift we cannot destroy in ourselves, the argument that refutes death, the genius that invents the future, all we can possibly know of God. It is the serum that makes us swear not to betray each other. It is in this poem she wrote, trying to speak. And so I took this poem into myself. And as I continued to live in Columbus and make family, I also made many friends who don't use the family words in our relationship, but whose love and care is absolutely central to me. And so I met my friend Rita. Rita just turned 100 a week ago. She's probably one of the most amazing people I've ever been lucky enough to meet. Her mouth is filled with stories all the time. In living such a long life in New York, she met everybody in the 20th century, as far as I can tell. She was good friends with Helen Keller, friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, on whom she used to play tricks. She's friends with Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, Leroy Jones, Mark Chagall. And then I met Jiggs, who loves my grandmotherly cooking, and he also is intending to be the new Neil deGrasse Tyson, the great cosmologist. He's studying to do this, and I'm really proud of him. He really is focusing on this a lot. And then my friend Christian. Christian is somebody I met 12 years ago when he was a heroin addict on the streets in Columbus. I met him in a cafe. He was off the street to get some coffee. Covered with tattoos, but shooting up all the time on the street, would disappear for 3 months. I would worry about him every day. I would just text him and say, "Hey Christian, I love you, I'm still here," and then he'd come back a little bit. But he eventually recovered. His body was not destroyed. The doctors were amazed. And graduated magna cum laude from Ohio State in creative writing, then went on to get his master's in creative writing at NYU in New York. And today he's getting married. And he's going to call me later on so I can participate in his wedding by phone. I helped to write the ceremony. I had scheduled the memorial service before he scheduled the wedding, so it didn't work out that way. But I'm going to be part of it. It's not going to be, technology has some good. And then my friend Chris is a farrier. Do you know what that is? Horseshoer, yeah. See, I didn't know when he told me he was a farrier. He and I have become very good friends. We go to visit all of the indigenous sites, archaeological sites in California, and I learn about horses from him, things I had no idea about. And then lastly, Bernie. Bernie's the man who I love most intimately right now. He's a skater, knitter, IT genius, gardener. A very deep-hearted man who I met quite by accident at my cousin Sergio's house in Los Angeles 12 years ago. And finally, the last slide shows holiday dinner at my place, at my loft, with all these people around me. And love and food through my grandmothers are identical. And so I make a great feast. They all come, they stay for 6 hours, and we all talk and laugh and have a wonderful time. And there's a lot of love around the table, and it all feels like the best part of life. I also have lunch every week with 3 friends, Du Bois, we call each other Du Bois. So, these last people I mentioned are friends. We don't use the term family like brother or sister or grandchild, but does it make any difference? Every member of my chosen family who does use such language and who don't use such language, they all embody the hope that propels me and safeguards me through my day-to-day life with the same kind of love that my grandmothers taught me so lavishly every single time I spent time with them. And this kind of hope in the form of unconditional, interpersonal, and devoted love has kept me from losing my mind with all the political corruption and cruel laws being passed state by state against my family and my Famiglia and my friends. And I know because of the love that I feel that despite the storms, the seeds will still sprout, because that's what they do. And in the words of our poet, my family and friends are singular gifts, all we know of God, the embodied genius which invents the future. And it's this tale of hope-filled love embodied in family and friends by which I have hopefully answered the question of the great Galilean posed 2,000 years ago.